It was an ordinary evening on Earth. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the small town where a young boy named Luke lived. Luke, no older than 8, was playing outside in his backyard, tossing a ball into the air and catching it with a grin. He loved these moments of peace where the world seemed calm and safe. But that night, everything was about to change. Suddenly, the air shifted. A strange hum filled the sky, faint at first, then growing louder and more intense. Luke stopped, his ball falling to the ground as he looked up. His heart skipped a beat. In the distance, the sky had turned a darker shade of blue, almost as if something enormous was blocking out the stars. The ground trembled slightly beneath his feet, and the humming noise was now deafening, vibrating through the very air. Out of nowhere, massive, cloaked ships appeared in the sky, so high that they seemed to hover right above the clouds. They were silent at first, like shadows waiting to strike. But then, they began descending rapidly. It was like something out of a nightmare. Luke's eyes widened in terror as the ships grew larger, and before he could even scream, a flash of light shot out from one of them. The beam hit Luke with such force that it knocked the air out of his lungs. He barely had time to react. A bright light surrounded him, pulling him off the ground. Panic set in. He tried to scream, to reach out for help, but the sound of his voice was drowned out by the roar of the ships above him. In a matter of seconds, he was lifted off his feet, soaring higher and higher. His body was being pulled through the air as if gravity had forgotten him. His little heart raced, pounding in his chest as he was taken from the only world he knew. From the ground below, all anyone could see was a small figure disappearing into the ship above. Luke's scream echoed through the air, but no one could hear it. His parents in their home would never know what had happened until it was too late. Inside the ship, the lights flickered as Luke was sucked into a metallic chamber. He struggled, kicking his legs and trying to break free from the unseen force that held him in place. The air was cold, sterile, and smelled of metal. He felt a sharp pain in his chest as his body slammed against the floor, and then he was thrown into a dark cell. The door shut behind him with a heavy clang. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing, his eyes wide with fear. The room around him was empty, save for the shadows that seemed to stretch and whisper. For a long moment, Luke could only stare at the cold walls, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He was alone, utterly and completely alone. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Where was he? What were those ships? And why had they taken him? It didn't take long for the sound of footsteps to echo through the hallway outside the cell. Luke held his breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps grew louder, until they stopped right outside his door. A panel in the wall slid open, and 2 alien creatures stepped inside. They were tall, their skin a deep shade of violet, with angular features and glowing eyes. Their clothing was sleek, made of dark metal that shimmered under the dim lights. The taller of the 2 creatures leaned down, inspecting Luke with a cold, calculating gaze. "You are a human," one of the aliens spoke, its voice mechanical, devoid of any warmth. Luke shuddered but didn't speak. He had no idea what they were planning to do with him, but he had the sinking feeling that it wasn't going to be good. The alien's eyes narrowed as it scanned Luke. A child. Interesting. Before Luke could react, the creature reached out with a gloved hand and grabbed him by the arm, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. He gasped in fear, struggling to break free, but the grip was unyielding. "You are going to be useful," the alien said. The other alien stepped forward and whispered something in its language, a language that Luke couldn't understand. He could only guess what they were saying, but the tone was harsh and commanding. Luke was dragged through a maze of cold, metallic hallways. The walls seemed to pulse with some strange energy, and strange machinery hummed in the background, making the place feel even more foreign and frightening. He was led into a large chamber, where a giant cage stood in the center. The walls of the cage were made of reinforced metal, and inside was a creature unlike anything Luke had ever seen. It was massive, easily 20 feet tall, with thick, armored skin and sharp claws that scraped against the floor as it paced. Its eyes were a glowing red, filled with a primal hunger. The creature's breathing was heavy, and its growls echoed in the chamber like the sound of distant thunder. Luke's stomach twisted in fear as he was thrown into the cage. The alien creatures stepped back, watching with cold amusement. "This is your fate," one of them said, their voice almost pitiful, but filled with an eerie satisfaction. "You will be fed to the Gorth." Luke's heart raced as he scrambled back, pressing himself against the cold metal bars of the cage. His mind was reeling with the horror of what was happening. He didn't know how or why this was happening to him, but all he could think about was how to escape, how to survive. But then something happened that no one could have predicted. The Gorth, the beast, paused. It stopped its pacing and turned its glowing red eyes toward Luke. The alien soldiers watched in confusion as the creature's expression softened, almost like it was curious. Luke held his breath, unable to move as the beast inched closer. Its massive form loomed over him, and he could feel the heat from its body radiating toward him. He braced himself for the worst. But then, the beast did something that shocked everyone. Instead of attacking, it lowered its head and sniffed Luke, gently nudging him with its snout. The aliens, who had been watching eagerly, stood frozen in place, their mouths agape. This child, this helpless human, had somehow done the impossible. The Gorth, the most savage and feared creature in the galaxy, wasn't attacking. Instead, it seemed to be intrigued. Luke, trembling but still alive, looked up at the creature, unsure of what to do. The Gorth sniffed him again, then let out a low, rumbling growl. But this time, the growl wasn't one of aggression. It was almost protective. Luke's heart began to race in a different way. Could this be his chance? Could this strange connection with the beast be his way out of this nightmare? The aliens stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what was happening. Something had changed, and they couldn't control it. The human child had somehow tamed the Gorth. The quiet silence that filled the chamber felt heavy, almost suffocating. Luke's heart was racing, yet somehow he felt a strange calmness settle over him. The Gorth, the enormous beast that had been prepared to devour him, was no longer a threat. Instead, it stood still, its glowing red eyes fixed on him with an expression that Luke couldn't quite understand. It was as if the creature was studying him, trying to make sense of who or what this small human was. Luke stood frozen, too afraid to move. His mind was in a whirlwind of confusion. 1 minute he had been on Earth, playing outside in his backyard. And now he was in a strange, cold alien ship, locked in a cage with a monstrous creature that could easily tear him apart. Yet here he was, alive, and the beast was behaving differently. Luke didn't know what to think. It was as though the animal had recognized something in him, some hidden connection that made it hesitate. For what felt like an eternity, the Gorth and Luke locked eyes. The beast's breath came in low, rumbling growls, but there was no aggression in them. Instead, it seemed almost curious. The massive creature's claws scraped against the metal floor as it shifted closer, its enormous body filling the small cage. Luke instinctively took a step back, but the Gorth didn't lunge at him. Instead, it lowered its head, the large, glowing eyes still fixed on him. Luke, still unsure of what was happening, slowly raised his hand. He wasn't sure why he did it, but something deep inside him told him to try. He extended his hand, trembling, toward the creature. The Gorth's nostrils flared, taking in Luke's scent, and for a moment, nothing happened. The tension was unbearable. But then, to Luke's astonishment, the creature gently nudged his hand with its cold, wet snout. The touch was surprising, soft even, considering the creature's enormous size. Luke's fear slowly began to fade, replaced by a mixture of wonder and disbelief. This wasn't a typical reaction from an apex predator, especially not one that had been bred to hunt and kill without mercy. He looked up at the Gorth, studying its massive form. It was intimidating, yes, but there was something about it now that felt less like a monster and more like a misunderstood creature. The aliens outside the cage had been watching this entire exchange in stunned silence. They stood still, their eyes wide, unsure of what to make of what they were witnessing. The Gorth, an animal trained to kill humans, was not attacking. Instead, it seemed to be bonding with the boy. "What is this?" one of the alien soldiers muttered, his voice filled with confusion. "Why is it not attacking?" The other alien merely shook his head. He had no explanation. No one had ever seen anything like this before. The Gorth was known to be the fiercest and most savage creature in the galaxy. It had been used in countless battles as a weapon of terror, its strength unmatched. The idea that it could form a bond with a human, especially a child, was impossible to comprehend. Luke's hand trembled as the Gorth nudged it again. He had never been this close to a creature so powerful, and yet he didn't feel in immediate danger. Instead, a strange sense of trust began to build between them. It was as if they both recognized that they were not enemies. Luke had heard stories of animals that could sense fear, and he wondered if the Gorth could sense something different in him, something that calmed it, even if only for a moment. The boy slowly lowered his hand, unsure of what to do next. The Gorth, still watching him with those unblinking eyes, seemed to understand. Its massive body shifted slightly, and it lay down, curling up in a protective manner, as if allowing Luke to rest nearby. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time since he had been taken, he felt a strange sense of safety. The beast had chosen not to harm him. It had even seemed to protect him. As the hours passed, Luke and the Gorth remained in the cage together. The alien soldiers outside the bars watched cautiously, their movements stiff and unsure. They had no idea what was going on between the human child and the beast. They had expected Luke to be devoured in moments, but instead they were witnessing an incredible shift. It was as if the Gorth had chosen the boy as its companion, and that decision was beyond their comprehension. Luke didn't know what the future held. He was trapped on this alien ship, with no way of knowing how or when he would get back home. But as he sat quietly next to the Gorth, he felt a small spark of hope. The beast wasn't the mindless killer the aliens had made it out to be. There was something more to it, something deeper that he couldn't fully understand. But one thing was certain. The Gorth had accepted him, and in its own way, it had become his protector. The bond that had formed between them, however strange, was undeniable. Luke couldn't explain it, but it was real. And in this dangerous alien world, it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. Meanwhile, the aliens outside the cage were growing increasingly uneasy. They had never seen the Gorth act this way before. It had always been an animal bred for war, a creature that was feared and revered for its ruthless power. But now, it was acting like a pet, responding to the boy's touch, almost protective of him. The soldiers exchanged worried glances, unsure of how to proceed. They had not expected this outcome. After what seemed like an eternity, one of the aliens stepped forward, his voice sharp and commanding. "Take the child. We will need to report this to the commanders." The other soldier hesitated but nodded. They had no choice. They needed to find out what this strange bond meant. But as they moved to open the cage, the Gorth's low growl rumbled through the room, a warning. The soldiers froze, eyes wide in alarm. The Gorth, sensing the shift in their intentions, was not willing to let Luke go without a fight. Its protective instincts had kicked in, and it was clear that it would not allow the aliens to take the boy without a struggle. The tension in the air grew thick, and Luke realized that this bond between him and the creature was far from over. It was just the beginning of something much larger, something that could change everything. The room was thick with tension. The alien soldiers had backed off slightly, watching the Gorith with wide eyes. It was as though the beast was a ticking time bomb, and every movement made by the soldiers seemed to make it grow more restless. Luke could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up, his pulse quickening. His hand, still lingering near the Gorith, trembled slightly. He couldn't explain it. This strange connection that was forming between them. All he knew was that the creature, once meant to destroy him, had become something else entirely. The air seemed to shift when the soldiers attempted to move closer. The Gorith's growl rumbled deep from its chest, vibrating the floor beneath Luke's feet. The low sound was a clear warning, one that sent a chill down Luke's spine. He could feel it in his gut. The creature was not going to let anyone come near him unless it trusted them. The fact that it had chosen to protect him was something Luke couldn't fathom, but it was real, and as long as the Gorith stood by him, he felt like he had a sliver of hope, even in the midst of being trapped on an alien ship light years from home. The soldiers hesitated, shifting nervously. They had never seen the Gorith act like this. This beast was known for its cruelty, bred for battle and destruction. It wasn't supposed to form bonds, especially not with a human. But there was something undeniable about the way the creature seemed to be protecting Luke. The Gorith had sniffed the boy out, seemed to have sensed something about him from the moment it laid eyes on him. It was almost as if the bond between them had formed instantly, as though the creature had always been meant to protect him. Luke slowly turned his gaze to the alien soldiers, realizing that they were afraid, unsure of how to handle the situation. They had prepared for many outcomes, but this wasn't one of them. The Gorith, a savage, was now playing the role of a defender, and it had chosen Luke. This connection wasn't just a strange anomaly. It was something far more powerful. Without a word, one of the soldiers motioned to the others. The orders were clear: get the child away from the Gorith. But as they moved forward again, the creature took another step closer to Luke, its body positioning itself as a barrier. The alien soldiers stopped dead in their tracks. The Gorith's protective stance was unyielding. It wasn't just standing guard. It was guarding Luke with everything it had. Luke didn't know what to do. His head was spinning. He had been taught to fear creatures like this. Humans had always been the prey, the weak ones who were hunted by the powerful alien species. Yet here he was, standing beside this beast that was supposed to be his enemy. And for some reason, it wasn't attacking. It was protecting him. He could feel the creature's massive presence, its low growls vibrating the air around them. But there was a strange sense of peace in that growl. The Gorith wasn't angry. It was determined. And that determination was focused solely on him. A soldier with a sharp, metallic voice spoke again, his words laced with annoyance. This isn't normal. The Gorith has never shown this kind of behavior before. Luke barely registered the words. His mind was too busy processing the situation. The Gorith had, without a doubt, decided that it was going to protect him. But what was more surprising to Luke was that he wasn't afraid. There was a certain trust between them now, an unspoken understanding that hadn't existed when the Gorith first entered the cage. The creature wasn't acting like an enemy. In fact, it wasn't acting like any predator he had ever read about in books or seen in movies. It was acting like something more. It was hard to explain, but Luke felt it deep inside. There was something about this creature, this Gorith, that was calling to him, urging him to stay calm, to trust in this bizarre bond that was growing between them. He could feel its muscles tense whenever the soldiers moved closer. He could hear its heartbeat echoing in the silence of the room, steady and strong. For the first time since he had been taken from Earth, he didn't feel completely alone. The Gorith was here. It wasn't just a beast. It was something more. Something that could feel. Something that, in a way, was now connected to him. But why? Why had the Gorith chosen him? What was it about Luke that made this dangerous creature act differently? Luke didn't have the answers, but as he stood next to the Gorith, he felt an unshakable truth in his chest. They were no longer just a human and an alien beast. There was something far deeper than that now. Suddenly, The silence in the room was broken by a loud bang. Something outside the cage had triggered a mechanism, and the door to the holding area began to creak open. Luke's eyes widened in fear. He wasn't sure who or what was on the other side, but his first instinct was to stay close to the Gorth. The creature's head whipped around, its eyes narrowing at the sound. Its growl deepened, and Luke could feel the air shift. It was ready to protect. The soldiers backed away, sensing the tension rising. Their weapons were at the ready, but they hesitated, unsure of how to approach the situation. The Gorth had never been so defensive before. It had never cared about protecting anyone. But here it was, its body positioned like a shield, and Luke could feel its energy. It was as if the creature understood the stakes. It wasn't just protecting him from the aliens. It was protecting him from whatever was about to happen next. Luke held his breath. His chest felt tight, and he wasn't sure if he was more afraid of the soldiers or the unknown threat on the other side of the door. But as the Gorth took a step forward, Luke suddenly understood something. The creature wasn't afraid. The bond between them, whatever it was stronger than any fear that either of them could feel. Luke wasn't alone. The Gorth had made sure of that. The door slowly creaked open, revealing a dark hallway beyond. Luke felt his heart race. Something was coming. But no matter what it was, he knew that the Gorth wouldn't let him face it alone. They were connected now, for better or for worse. And in that connection, Luke found an unexpected strength. For the first time since his capture, Luke knew that he wasn't completely powerless. The creature at his side, his protector, would stand with him. And together, they would face whatever came next. The air felt electric as the door to the holding area slowly opened, revealing the dimly lit corridor beyond. Luke could feel his pulse quicken, his breath shallow with anticipation. The Gorth's muscles tensed beside him, its eyes narrowing as it carefully examined the hallway. There was something lurking in the shadows. He could feel it, the presence of something unknown and dangerous. But Luke wasn't as afraid as he thought he would be. The Gorth was there, standing guard like an impenetrable wall, and somehow that gave Luke the strength to face whatever was about to happen. The soldiers hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. They had seen the Gorth's protective stance, but the real question was, what had made it change? It was a creature bred for destruction, designed to obey only the harshest commands, yet here it was, standing between Luke and the alien forces that wanted him dead. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, weapons drawn, but none of them made a move. Luke felt the weight of their stares on him, but he focused on the corridor ahead. The faint hum of machinery echoed down the dark hallway, and he could hear the soft scurrying sounds of something moving just out of sight. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure. The Gorth wouldn't let anyone harm him. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional hiss of air from the ventilation system. The Gorth's growl was low, almost a whisper, but it was enough to make the soldiers take a step back. Luke didn't know if the creature's instincts had told it to protect him, or if something deeper was at play. But in that moment, it felt like the two of them were linked by something powerful. The Gorth wasn't just an animal. It was something more. And as much as Luke wanted to understand it, he knew he had to focus on the immediate danger. Suddenly, a sharp metallic sound echoed down the hallway, followed by the heavy footsteps of something or someone approaching. Luke's heart skipped a beat. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet remained frozen in place. The Gorth stood firm, its eyes locked on the source of the noise, ready to act. Luke glanced around frantically. There was nowhere to hide. The only thing he could do was stay close to the creature and hope it would protect him. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was tall, humanoid in shape but clearly alien, with glowing red eyes and sleek black armor. Luke could tell immediately that it wasn't one of the soldiers he had seen earlier. This was someone higher up, someone with power. The alien stopped just a few feet away, its piercing gaze locking with Luke's. For a moment, There was a strange stillness between them, as if the air itself had been held in suspense. Luke didn't know what to do. Should he speak? Should he beg for mercy? But the Gorth stepped forward, its massive body blocking Luke from view. The alien glanced at the creature, then back at Luke, and for a brief moment, there was an unreadable expression on its face. Luke could see the wariness in its posture. This was no ordinary soldier. It knew that the Gorth wasn't to be taken lightly. You shouldn't be here," the alien said, its voice low but firm. There was a coldness to its words, but Luke didn't flinch. He stood his ground, not because he was brave, but because something in him, the connection with the Gorth, gave him courage. The alien's gaze flicked to the Gorth, then back to Luke, narrowing with suspicion. "What is this? How did you?" The words trailed off, replaced by a flash of realization. It knew something was wrong. Something was happening that couldn't be explained. The Gorth, an apex predator designed for war, was behaving strangely, and it was guarding a human child. Something that had never happened before. Luke wasn't sure what the alien was thinking, but he could see its hand slowly moving toward its weapon. He didn't wait to find out what would happen next. "No," Luke muttered under his breath, taking the step forward. His voice was shaky, but there was a fire in his eyes. He wasn't going to let this alien hurt him, not with the Gorth standing right there. He felt the creature's steady presence beside him, its gaze unwavering. Together, they could face whatever came next. Together, they could fight. Without warning, the alien lunged, pulling a long, gleaming blade from its side. Luke flinched, but before he could react, the Gorth was already in motion. The massive creature charged forward with incredible speed, its claws outstretched. It moved like a blur, too fast for the alien to react. The alien tried to raise its weapon, but the Gorth was faster. With a deafening roar, the beast swiped its claws across the alien's chest, sending the soldier crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. Luke stumbled back, wide-eyed. The sheer power of the Gorth was overwhelming. He had never seen anything move so fast, so with such precision. The alien lay on the floor, groaning, but it was clear that the Gorth wasn't finished. The creature stepped back, its claws dripping with the alien's blood, and turned its head toward Luke, as if waiting for a command. Luke's breath was heavy, his heart racing, but he didn't know what to say. What could he say? The Gorth had just saved his life in an instant, and now he realized just how much power the beast held. It wasn't just protecting him, it was fighting for him, and that realization was overwhelming. But this was only the beginning. Luke knew that this was just the first battle. The alien soldiers would be back, and they would be angrier than ever. The Gorth had made its move, but the rebellion was far from over. The strange bond between him and the creature was growing stronger, and together they would fight against the alien empire that had taken everything from him. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were rebelling. As the alien soldiers regrouped and began to circle around them, Luke took a deep breath. This was no longer just a fight for survival. This was a fight for freedom. And with the Gorth by his side, Luke knew that they had a chance. The rebellion had begun. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, harsh and steady. Luke's heart raced as the metallic hum of the alien ship grew louder. The brief fight with the soldier had been a wake-up call. He knew the enemy was not going to back down easily. The Gorth stood beside him, its massive form a comforting presence in the chaos. It had proven itself once again, defending Luke with unmatched strength, but there was no time to dwell on that victory. The real fight was just beginning. Luke pressed himself against the cold wall, his breath shallow as he listened. The air was thick with tension, and the sounds of the alien soldiers' voices were getting closer. He could hear their clipped, angry words in a language he didn't understand. The anger in their voices was unmistakable, and Luke knew they would come in full force now. The Gorth had proven it was a threat, and the aliens wouldn't take kindly to being humiliated by a mere creature, and a human, at that. But Luke wasn't the scared, helpless child he had been when they first captured him. He had seen what the Gorith was capable of, and he had learned a lot in the short time they had been together. There was a growing sense of understanding between them, a bond that Luke couldn't explain but felt deeply. He wasn't just hiding anymore, he was ready to fight back. This wasn't just survival, it was rebellion, and he was no longer going to be a passive player in his own story. As the soldiers rounded the corner, their eyes falling on Luke and the Gorith, it was clear they had come prepared. More advanced weapons, heavier armor. They weren't going to make the same mistake twice. But what they didn't know was that Luke had learned something too. In the time since their first encounter, he had watched the Gorith closely. He had seen how it reacted to the soldiers, how it used its strength and speed. But more than that, he had realized that the creature had instincts that could be used. The soldiers hesitated for a split second, eyes flicking nervously to the Gorith. It had already taken down one of them, and now they were unsure if they were going to be able to overpower it. Luke saw his chance. Without thinking, he made a split-second decision. He moved quickly, slipping through the shadows, keeping low to the ground. The Gorith, still watching the soldiers with its deadly focus, didn't notice at first. Luke pulled out one of the alien weapons that had been left behind after the fight and held it tightly in his hands, unsure of how to use it, but determined. The soldiers advanced, their weapons raised. They clearly thought they had the upper hand, but Luke's eyes never left the Gorith. This was his moment. He wasn't just going to wait for the creature to fight his battles. He had to fight alongside it, make them understand that they weren't just a boy and a beast anymore. They were a team. He aimed the alien weapon at one of the soldiers, his hands trembling with adrenaline. He had no training, no idea what he was doing, but he squeezed the trigger anyway. A sharp, high-pitched whine filled the air as the energy blast shot forward, striking the soldier in the chest. The alien cried out in surprise and pain as the energy blast sent him crashing to the ground. Luke's heart pounded in his chest. It worked. He couldn't believe it, but the weapon had done its job. The other soldiers turned in shock, eyes wide as they realized that Luke wasn't just a helpless human anymore. The fear in their eyes was real now, and that was the key. Luke had just turned the tables on them. No longer was he the victim. Now he was a threat. He had weapons, and he had the Gorith. Together, they were unstoppable. The Gorith roared, its fierce growl reverberating through the ship's hallways, a challenge to any who would stand in its way. Luke barely had time to think as the creature lunged at the nearest soldier, claws slashing through the air with incredible precision. The soldier barely had time to react before the Gorith's claws tore through his armor, sending him sprawling to the floor in a heap of blood and sparks. The remaining soldiers scattered, trying to regroup. They knew they were in trouble. The Gorith was a beast of war, and Luke was now armed and willing to fight. Together, they were an unstoppable force. But even as they retreated, Luke knew this wasn't over. The aliens were smart. They would regroup and come up with a new plan, and Luke couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Keep moving. Luke shouted to the Gorith. It seemed to understand him more with each passing moment, as if the bond between them had solidified into something deeper, something almost like a mutual understanding. They had become more than just a human and a beast. They were partners now, fighting side by side. They ran down the hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Luke's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. They couldn't just keep running. They needed to find a way to strike back, to turn the tables completely. They needed to hit the aliens where it hurt the most. As they approached a set of large doors, Luke spotted something, a control panel just to the side of the entrance. He moved toward it quickly, praying it was still functional. The Gorith stood guard, watching for any sign of the enemy. Luke pressed a few buttons, hoping the controls were the same as the ones on Earth. A low hum filled the air, and the doors slowly slid open, revealing a control room filled with alien technology. Luke's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the heart of the alien ship. If he could control the ship's systems, he could turn the tide in their favor. But there was no time to waste. The soldiers were already recovering from their initial shock. They wouldn't let him have long before they came after him again. He dove into the control panel, fingers flying over the buttons, trying to decipher the alien language. Behind him, the Gorith growled in warning. The soldiers were closing in, but Luke didn't look back. He had to focus. Every second counted. A loud alarm suddenly blared, and Luke's blood ran cold. He had triggered something, perhaps an internal security system. But it didn't matter. The soldiers were right outside now. He had to act fast. "Gorith," Luke shouted, turning to the creature. "Get ready." The core room was heavily guarded, but Luke wasn't about to let that stop him. He and the Gorith had fought too hard to be turned back now. He charged forward, bursting through the doors and into the chamber where the heart of the ship pulsed with energy. The soldiers were waiting for him, but Luke had no fear. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. The Gorith moved beside him, its eyes glowing with an intensity that matched Luke's own. The soldiers rushed forward, but this time it was different. Luke had the upper hand. He fired the alien weapon, striking down the first soldier with a shot that left a trail of sparks. The Gorith didn't hesitate, charging into the fray and slashing at the soldiers with terrifying speed. There was no mercy in its movements. It was the predator, and the soldiers were its prey. Luke moved through the chaos, focusing on the control panel in the center of the room. He had only one shot at this. If he could get to the panel and override the systems, the ship would be his. He ran toward it, his breath coming in quick gasps. The soldiers were still coming at him, but the Gorith was clearing a path, tearing through them with the same deadly precision it had shown in their previous battles. With a final leap, Luke reached the control panel. His hands flew over the buttons, trying to remember everything he had learned in the past few days. The alien interface flickered in front of him, and for a moment, he was unsure if he was doing it right. But then he pressed one final button. The room hummed, and the ship's core lights flickered as the system acknowledged his input. The alarms stopped. The hum of the ship's engines grew quiet. The soldiers froze in their tracks, looking around in confusion. Luke had done it. He had gained control of the ship. With a victorious smile, Luke turned toward the Gorith. The creature stood tall, its eyes glowing with pride. Together, they had defeated the alien forces. They had taken control of their fate. But there was more to this victory than just survival. Luke had found something he had never expected. A true ally in the Gorith. And the bond between them had been forged in the heat of battle, unbreakable and strong. Now, the galaxy was theirs. No longer would they be hunted. They would no longer be the prey. Luke and the Gorith stood side by side in the heart of the alien ship, victorious but not without sacrifice. The battle had been hard, and many had fallen. But Luke had learned one thing through it all. No matter the odds, no matter the size of the enemy, humans could always fight back. And with the Gorith by his side, Luke knew that the fight was far from over. It had only just begun.